Thanks everybody for joining our discussion today, Open Democracy's live discussion looking at the issue of why is global Britain cutting foreign aid? I'm Peter Gagan, I'm the investigations editor here at Open Democracy. And we want this conversation to involve you, the viewers and the listeners as much as possible. And I want to thank everybody who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to be addressing as many of these as we can during the chat. And if you're joining us on Zoom, and you have a question or comment for us, click on the chat icon on the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. And people watching on Facebook can put their questions in the comments there too. So there's lots of different ways to get involved. And so today's topic, as I mentioned, is why is global Britain cutting foreign aid? It's kind of, the British government has said that it's going to open up to the world after Brexit. And earlier this month, we had the integrated review came out, a long-awaited document, which is all about Britain's kind of diplomatic and defence policy for the coming years. But in that, I think a lot of people were asking the question, where does development fit into that? As Open Democracy reported earlier this couple of weeks ago, we already knew there was a large cuts coming to Britain's overseas development assistance. It's going to be cut from 0.7 to 0.5% of gross national income over in the coming year, but we actually didn't know where some of those cuts were going to land, and we reported about just kind of where they're going to happen. There's serious, significant cutbacks going to happen in a lot of conflict zones in the world, places like Yemen, but also Syria, South Sudan, Libya, and that's raised a lot of questions about what's the kind of approach that Britain's going to take in the coming years, and kind of bouncing off the integrated review. There was also the wider idea of this notion of global Britain, this idea of post-Brexit Britain having a more outward-looking focus on the world, and this idea that Britain's kind of has a new role to play in the world. I think we're going to try and interrogate some of what that means. What does this mean? Does global Britain have a global vision? And if it does, what is it? There's some of the criticism that came in the back of the integrated review is that a lot of talk about increases in defence, but how does that square with other things like Britain's diplomatic and particularly its development role? And last year, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Foreign Office basically was merged with DFID, with the Department for International Development, to build this new department, the FCDO, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And that's been a huge change, for Britain's kind of foreign policy and for its kind of outward-looking aspects of British policy. And I think there's a lot to be kind of gone in about, well, what does that mean? It's one of the things we're going to explore as well today. And of course, this is all happening against the backdrop of the pandemic, the global COVID pandemic that's happening around the world. So, we've got someone like, Britain is talking about being a global player, but how does that square with the decisions to cut aid at a time of pandemic? And who are going to be the losers, and I guess who are going to be the winners from some of these cuts to foreign aid, because they take in everything from humanitarian work to global anti-corruption efforts. And I'm really lucky to be joined, we're all really lucky to be joined by a great panel of experts to talk about some of these issues and to tease some of them out. Andrew Mitchell is a Conservative MP and former Secretary of State for International Development. Oliver Bullough is a journalist and the author of Moneyland, Why Thieves and Crooks Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back. Sarah Chayes is the author and anti-corruption activist, and her most recent book is On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. And Alina Rocha Menocal is a Principal Research Fellow of Politics and Governance at the Overseas Development Institute. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. Andrew, I think I might turn to you first, because I think in some ways, you've got a perspective on things that are very current. I was really struck to see Neil Parish, a fellow Conservative MP and the chairman of the Environment Committee, writing today in the Times, warning about the aid budget cuts and the damage it could do to climate change work ahead of the COP26, which obviously is coming to Britain later this year, coming to Glasgow, actually, the city I'm in as we speak. And a number of Conservative MPs have spoken out about these proposed cuts, including you. And I kind of just wanted to get your sense of why do you think this issue is animating so many of your colleagues? And do you think we have is there a chance that this could eventually come to a vote in Parliament?
Well, good evening. I mean, the reason it's animating colleagues is because, as someone once said, it's worse than a crime, it's a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is because it's clearly not being done for economic reasons. The 4 billion that would be saved by the reduction from 0.7 to 0.5 is 1% of the money that's been borrowed in the last year, quite rightly, for fighting COVID. So it's 1% is a rounding error in the Treasury's balance sheet. So it's clearly not been done for economic reasons. It's being done for cultural reasons, and it's being done because ministers think that it goes down well in the red wall seats, which voted Conservative in the last election, who don't like seeing money spent overseas on foreign aid. And quite apart from being extremely patronising to people in the red wall seats, who are often the first to go and raise money through car boot sales and pub quizzes when there's a famine or there's a flood in a poor part of the world, ministers think that 81% of people in the red wall seats don't approve of sending foreign assistance overseas, and that charity starts at home. But while charity does start at home, it doesn't end there. And other polling conducted by Conservative homes say that 92% of people in the red wall seats do not approve of cutting humanitarian aid. So my point is, it's not economic. It is political, and it's a breach of a promise that was made to the poorest people in the world. It's a breach of a manifesto commitment that every single member of the House of Commons was elected on just over a year ago. And it's taking place at a point where Britain is chairing the G7, chairing the COP. All the comments in Red Box and the Times made by my friend and colleague Neil Parish are absolutely correct. But we're chairing the G7, and we are the only country in the G7 that is cutting aid. In the middle of a pandemic, the Americans are increasing their aid and foreign assistance by $15 billion. The French have now embraced the 0.7. Germany hit the 0.7 last year. We are the only country, and we are supposed to be a leader. And the integrated review would normally have celebrated the fact that on soft power, Britain is an intellectual and huge leader through its work, coordinated through DFID, which would join together the great universities and the great British international NGOs and the think tanks like ODI. So it's an inexplicable shot in the foot done for cynical and ill-informed reasons, and it's a terrible mistake. And of course, the people who will pay for this mistake are the people, for example, in Yemen, where we know that a man-made famine has started, where hundreds of thousands of children are starving to death. Anyone who's visited a ward which combats malnutrition in the developing world will know just how unbelievably distressing this is, totally avoidable. And Britain cutting at this point, when there's a famine in Yemen, is unconscionable.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Just to pick up on that, actually, Alina, I'd like to kind of to move to you, because I think, you know, Andrew mentioned there about this issue of soft power, and, you know, like we at Open Democracy and others have been reporting about the impact of some of these cuts on overseas development assistance in countries like Andrew's talking about, a place like Yemen, also on research that British universities conduct, you know, around the world, often again in countries, developing countries, but also just, you know, massive global kind of footprint for academic research has been cut almost overnight. And I guess I was wondering, for someone like you from ODI, how do these cuts, do you think, threaten the UK's positioning as a global soft power in this kind of context of the language around global Britain?
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm a huge fan of Open Democracy and have been so for years. And I deeply admire the work that you have been doing. And I'm very grateful that you in particular have picked up this story of the cuts in foreign aid, which I think is really important to have out there. For me, this is a bit of an approach of cake and eating it too. Can the UK aspire to be global Britain while at the same time disengaging from the world in such a profound way? Stating that you are a soft power superpower, as is in the intention of the integrated review, does not make you one. And you need to show real commitment. And in this sense, actions speak much more loudly than words. So what are some of the main sources of soft power that the UK has been able to draw on today to contribute to a world that is safer, more equitable, and more prosperous? And I think a lot of this has to do with the leadership that the UK has shown in international development over the past 2 decades. The work that the UK has championed, funded, and supported through its development assistance, including in particular through the Department of International Development, which Andrew headed at some point, has been widely recognized as world-beating, if I dare use that language. And at one point, someone like Angela Merkel herself referred to the FID as one of the UK's, quote, crown jewels. This work has been agenda setting on a world scale, in particular in terms of the need to understand development in all its complexity and in designing and implementing programs accordingly, in terms of placing politics and governance at the center of the challenge to build more peaceful, stable, resilient, and open states and societies, and in focusing on ongoing learning and adaptation to address these complex development challenges more effectively. You have mentioned, Peter, research, and UK-funded research has also been a very important part of this story. Research and evidence are essential in understanding what works, what doesn't work, and why, which you need to improve policy and practice. And through a variety of UK-supported research programs and research funds, UK universities like Birmingham and other research institutions like ODI, as Andrew has mentioned, have been able to develop world-class partnerships and collaborations across the Global South and to provide evidence-based responses to pressing problems ranging from global health, climate and conflict to education, women's empowerment, and governance. In this way, UK international development assistance has played a critical role in enabling the UK to become a world leader in tackling global challenges. So these cuts in aid we are seeing right now, both within FCDO and UKRI, directly undercut the very tools and mechanisms of soft power that the UK has at its disposal to give substance and meaning to the idea of global Britain. These cuts, and especially the way in which they are being made, damage UK's reputation, standing, and leadership on the world stage. UK international development aid has been an incredibly successful example of global Britain at its best. There is a crucial opportunity for the UK to continue to lead through its soft power, but this requires building on this success rather than undermining it. And this is a positive vision of global Britain that we should all be working towards. And if, as Andrew has said, it is a mistake, let's hope no mistake is irreversible and that there still may be time to correct it. Thank you so much. And thanks also for all the help figuring out how to get back on and all of that.
Thank you very much. Oliver, you know, Alina's touched on there a lot of the kind of wider issues of these sort of cuts, but, you know, we were reporting on Open Democracy recently about anti-corruption in particular, you know, and potential cuts to the anti-corruption budget, because that's become part of the work that Britain does. It has got rolled into ODA over the years. And in some ways, you know, what counts as overseas development assistance has become a more capacious thing over the years. We've kind of rolled more things into it, and anti-corruption's become part of that. And the National Crime Agency's work around international anti-corruption has become part of it. So I kind of, you know, what are your thoughts on that, and the potential to kind of, that we could see some cuts in Britain's anti-corruption work?
Well, one thing that differed when it still existed, when before it was joined together with the Foreign Office, when it was very good at was recognizing that it isn't much good, you know, giving someone food if simultaneously someone else is stealing the food. You know, that you need to simultaneously try and prevent the theft of food if you're helping someone, because otherwise you're just pouring water into a bucket with a giant hole at the bottom. You know, and I think this, you know, this awareness at DFID went all the way back to, you know, when Claire Short was running the ministry back in the Tony Blair days, and then even before Andrew was in charge of it. And you know, and you can see it's sort of amazing if you look at sort of statements from DFID 2 or 3 years ago, in which, you know, tackling corruption and organized crime in this really sort of, you know, joined up, to use that horrible jargon term, way, was very much part of DFID's job. It saw, you know, funding law enforcement, helping, you know, people to keep what you know, what we gave them, as part of its job. And I find it extraordinary how in the last year that's just gone. To an extraordinary degree. I mean, you're talking about the way that, you know, that the funding for anti-corruption program in Tanzania has been cut away. I mean, that's particularly ironic. I mean, you know, Claire Short, when she was in charge of DFID in the early 2000s, or in late 1990s, practically went to war with the Blair government over a Tanzania corruption investigation with BAE Systems. You know, and the fact that it's Tanzania is just particularly grim and ironic, because that was one of the real sort of signature early signs of DFID's success. And it seems that there's been this sort of general capitulation in the face of, you know, oligarchs and global corruption by British law enforcement, which is particularly grim. I mean, you know, the International Corruption Unit in the National Crime Agency has a budget of £4.3 million. You know, that for an oligarch, I mean, you know, what is that? You know, what's £4.3 million? That's the Moët and Chandon budget for a year. You know, that's, yeah, they might spend that on a, you know, on a holiday. It's a rounding error for an oligarch. And, you know, and there's this really particularly dispiriting quote in the report into, you know, Russian interference published last year, but from Lynn Owens from the National Crime Agency, saying about taking on an oligarch, says we're bluntly concerned about the impact that would have on our budget. You know, and we've gone from this, you know, a country that had a really, you know, strong conceptual approach to combining anti-corruption work with giving foreign aid. And okay, you know, I'm not saying we were perfect, but at least it was happening. There was an idea that this was important. We're cutting all that budget and essentially capitulating. And I find that really depressing, to be honest. And this sign, if global Britain is essentially a sign that we're not going to enforce anti-corruption rules, and you know, you saw it all the way through the integrated review. There was no recognition at all that Britain was a problem as an international enabler of corruption. It's nothing at all. It was just, you know, we will help fight organized crime. There was this really depressing line, you know, that our new sanctions policy, our post-Brexit sanctions policy, will complement existing anti-corruption tools. You know, well, great. Yeah, that's like anyway. It's just depressing, to be honest. I don't really have anything else to say.
On that cheery note, Oliver, thanks for that. Sarah, you know, I kind of wanted to really bring you in here because, you know, you're somebody who has worked a lot internationally, you know, first as a reporter, and then you've worked, you're very involved working in Afghanistan, trying to rebuild the country after the war. You've reported a lot and written a lot about issues around corruption. We had a really interesting chat on the phone a few weeks ago that, like, it was a very sunny day, and I was really trying to end my working week, and I called you up and I was like, oh, I'm really enjoying this chat, so let's just keep talking. And we were talking a lot about these issues around corruption, but also, you know, the kind of, you know, I'm picking up from Oliver's point too, we have a tendency to see these things as something that exists outside of us. You know, corruption is something that doesn't happen here. And I just wanted to kind of bring you in there to kind of get your thoughts on it. Like, is there a way in which, like, we've, you know, like, kind of by thinking purely about things like anti-corruption and transparency is something that doesn't happen at home, that we're missing something, and that means that contributes to why efforts to try and work internationally have struggled?
Yeah, and maybe why corruption has become such an odd issue that, you know, that really has become more mainstream, frankly, and not least thanks to the UK and then Prime Minister Cameron's efforts in 2016, you know, really to put it high on the agenda, and to slide in behind Oliver. It's not just a waste of food that you're offering in a humanitarian crisis. Corruption is often the root cause of that humanitarian crisis, or of that terrorist insurgency, or of that conflict. And I do agree with all the nice things that have been said about DFID, having worked in the field with people either who were DFID employees or were funded by DFID. I mean, it has been noticeable to me when I've been a practitioner in the field how good the UK efforts have been, including in particular what Alina was referring to, the kind of research end of it and the real effort to adjust to circumstances, to understand root causes, to address root causes. And finally, I should also just say that DFID is a frugal agency. I mean, when I was working directly with DFID, no one had a desk. They were doing hot desking because it was, you know, too expensive, and they couldn't give us a cup of coffee when we met with them because that was against the rules. So it's not like this is a gigantically luxurious organization. But the point you make, I think, is the one that troubles me most greatly is, you know, again, Oliver has done fantastic work along with a number of other researchers, really putting the spotlight on Western enablers of kleptocratic governance overseas, and how much our business models are predicated on, you know, dirty money, transferring it, banking it, putting it into real estate, et cetera, et cetera. And because of that economic model, we're all increasingly less, you know, interested in looking at where people's money comes from, right? But as you suggest, Peter, it's not just that some Western industries are facilitating the kleptocratic behavior of networks in the developing world. Rather, increasingly, our own governments start to mirror the structures that I spent, you know, a decade analyzing and exploring in developing countries. And so, in that context, I'd like to ask a slightly deeper question maybe about corruption assistance. As Andrew said, actions speak louder than words. And some of those actions are the spending of money. But what about the actions of our own governments at home or in their foreign policies? So again, to give a kind of parallel, a US parallel, not to speak about the UK, but you know, we had a drama in the United States about anti-corruption, US anti-corruption policy toward Ukraine. Well, I was trying to do anti-corruption policy in Afghanistan when the, you know, top reaches of the US government were not interested in pursuing serious anti-corruption. However, you know, at least all they did was shut up about it, right? They didn't say anything. So we lacked, I mean, a corrupt network is a vertically integrated structure. So when it reaches the top of the developing country, you're at a chief of state to chief of state level interaction. And so I knew that we were going to fail in Afghanistan because our chief of state at the time, Barack Obama, was not interested in engaging. So we were going to fail. However, I did not have a chief of state who actively tarnished, you know, fired and actively tarnished the reputation of the one ambassador that we had who was pursuing serious anti-corruption activities. And so what I want to say is that anti-corruption efforts overseas are embedded within a larger set of messages that kleptocratic leaders overseas are taking in. And the very, very strongest message is what is that country's government actually doing? And so that's, and then further, I would just add that I'm a little skeptical about spending on programs, particularly anti-corruption programs, being the equivalent of doing good anti-corruption work. So what spending on anti-corruption programs implies is that you siloize, you pull out anti-corruption and make that the job of specialized anti-corruption people at DFID, and you spend some money on it. And so you could have an entire international development approach to a country being one of corrupt networks exchanging with corrupt networks, right? British corrupt networks interacting and having transactional relationships with the corrupt network in, you know, Yuckistan. And then spending 100,000 or 200,000 quid on some little anti-corruption program on the side. That is not going to, you know, advance the cause of anti-corruption. So what I would much rather see with respect to corruption in particular would be for an anti-corruption approach to be integrated into all of the mainstream development programs. And I would also like to see a lot of UK domestic spending be focused on all of the types of corrupt activities that, having not done the research on UK that I've done on the US, I don't know exist, but I highly suspect exist in Britain.
So just bouncing off that, sir, I feel like, you know, and I think, you know, you've talked a bit about there about like government. So I might bring Andrew in at this stage too to kind of ask a little bit more, to tease about some of these questions, because I think it is an interesting question about like the role of government and like kind of at home and what it's doing, but also I think there's about all of these debates, you're looking at the integrated review, but more generally, even since I've started like writing about this, it does feel to be a tension between what might be UK national interest and whether you want to call it being a force for good in the world, or what that might look like. And I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Andrew. Is there stuff, do you feel like that's attention? And do you think that there's, is there things that the government could be doing to address some of the issues at home, the kind of things that Oliver's written a lot about, say, about the City of London?
Well, there certainly is, and Oliver's book, his not the most recent one, I think, but the one before that, is like reading the Sun newspaper without the pictures. I mean, it's a very powerful expose of precisely what is happening, and it's explained in a way that brings the reader with you. And it's appalling. And when I was DFID secretary, I said to the City of London police, who are the best at this stuff, I said, you can have as much money as you want, so long as you justify to my officials that you will spend it well fighting corruption. And the truth was their capacity wasn't as great as Oliver would wish, as I would wish. I mean, the point that was made by Sarah about DFID's focus on anti-corruption measures is absolutely true. And remember that DFID was widely regarded, not least by the NAO, as the most transparent department in Whitehall. And it's worth remembering this too, that whenever Tony Blair told me that whenever he went on an international conference where money was being discussed, he always took a senior DFID official. Why? Because DFID does money, or did money, and the Foreign Office did prose. The Foreign Office is notoriously useless with money. And frankly, the British taxpayer should be getting the heebie-jeebies at the idea that an ambassador or a high commissioner is in charge of a multi-million-pound development project, because it's a recipe for chaos and bad spending and a huge mistake. Remember, the Foreign Office, I used to tease them about this, but the Foreign Office thinks that development is the ambassador's spouse's favorite charity, which it isn't. It's a long-term thing. And tackling corruption and doing all the things that Oliver talks about, and which Margaret Hodge, my friend and colleague on the other side of the house, and I have tried to use Oliver's excellent bullets to make some progress in terms of legislation, and we have made some progress. And you'll be interested to hear, Peter, that although the Foreign Office fought us tooth and nail over the open registers of beneficial ownership in, for example, the overseas territories, really fought it hard. They issued a press release about 2 months ago saying that it was all going very well and this was government policy, and they were delighted to report progress. And I sent Rob a text saying whichever official drafted that written statement should be given a pay rise, because they've clearly got a brass neck in saying that. And he sent me back a WhatsApp saying, very true, it was me who drafted it. So, I mean, so actually it is true that Dominic Raab is a good, prospectively good development minister, because he's good on human rights and he's good on civil liberties. And those are very important aspects of fighting corruption and of international development. And he did fight like a tiger to retain the 0.7 budget, but was overruled by Boris and the beastly Treasury.
Do you think there's much prospect, just picking up on that very quickly, is there much prospect of actually coming to a vote in Parliament?
Well, the government thinks they might lose a vote, and I've spent the last 2 months, organising colleagues to resist this, and I can confirm that they might well lose the vote, and therefore they don't want to vote, which is a bit of a pity, really, because we were all told that Brexit was about putting more power into the British Parliament, and so the government refusing to hold votes and running away from democracy in that way is rather disheartening. But we've got this wonderful legal opinion from the greatest chambers in the UK, Matrix, which says that the government shouldn't do this, and it's changing the law, so therefore its budget is unlawful. But the problem with the law is that judicial review takes forever, and by the time we nailed it, the horse would have bolted. So we will lie in wait, as we did before. Oliver will remember, as we did before in the open registers. We will lie in wait for a bill that we can amend. But as the time goes by, it gets more difficult. And really, the bookend for all this activity is the COP in November in your city, Peter.
Thanks very much for that, Andrew. I kind of picking up a little bit on that. Like, I feel like there's that tension that many people talk about, that kind of frames this discussion, this idea of global Britain, but some of the things that you're talking about, like cuts to the ODA budget. And I kind of wanted to see, I wanted to bring in the voice from the United States again, just briefly, to get a sense of how does this, because we're very interested in the conversation, how things are seen in Britain, from Washington in particular for Britain at the moment. There's a lot of almost Bidenology, a kind of new version of Kremlinology. If anyone in the Biden administration says anything, everyone pours over to get a sense of, is it good or bad for us? And I kind of wanted to get a sense, how do you think this is going to be interpreted in the United States? How do you think it's going to affect the British-US relationship in the coming years, Sarah?
I mean, it's a bit complicated with the US trying to, first of all, I just have to say we are so self-oriented at the moment. I mean, we just, we're doing Bidenology too, every single, so with that in mind, and with, frankly, I have to say, Europe looming larger as a target in terms of how to reestablish alliances and relationships. The focus obviously is a little bit more on Europe because that's a lot more countries with a broader swath of the world geographically and potentially, relationships then with and through Europe with other countries than the UK. I mean, I have to say that's a piece of it, is the UK has marginalized itself to some extent via Brexit. It's only one country. Whereas, and it is such a scramble for the Biden administration to try to, I think, restore and repair some of the broken furniture left behind from our last administration, that Britain won't, is not going to be as much of a focus of attention immediately. But I can't imagine that with the US trying to reach back out to the rest of the world. I mean, it's just a bit out of step for the UK to be in this other place, and echoing to some extent, I think, aspects of the Trump administration's approach that the Biden administration is anxious to, unwind. But I mean, just to add one little thing, internationally, it is a change, because internationally, and particularly with respect both to military and development operations, that partnership was extremely close. And again, I kind of lived it in particular in Afghanistan, where there was no question that the UK-US kind of axis was critical to that effort. And another really interesting place where I saw a very in tandem US-UK approach was Nigeria around the election of 2015. And that was a hand-in-glove approach that was incredibly effective, actually. And I think it was precisely because at a key moment, you had two foreign ministers calling the president of Nigeria saying, cut the crap, essentially, that really allowed an election to go forward. And so there's definitely going to be some rearranging going on.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I just wanted to kind of one of the other things I think that when it comes to the issue of development aid and the kind of questions that both you and Andrew have been touching on there, the kind of issue of the kind of global role of states like Britain and America. I think some people, there's also questions about how useful is aid? Do we do aid in the way we should do aid? Is it? And I think I don't even know when I started writing these stories, we had a bit of pushback about people going, well, maybe this isn't a bad thing that we're going to cut some of this aid. Maybe it doesn't work very well. Maybe it only profits, large NGOs who know how to do this. And kind of, Alina, I wanted to get your take a little bit on this, is it a big deal that we're doing this? To play devil's advocate with it, is all of this aid well spent? Is there other ways we could be using this?
Thank you very much, Peter. I mean, I think this is a really important question, and I think one has to be really honest about the challenge of international development. And by the way, just to highlight that these are not challenges that only happen sort of over there in the global south, as we see with the case of corruption. Some of these challenges are palpable everywhere. And for example, with the crisis in legitimacy that democracy is suffering. Some of the most established democracies in the world, including the UK and the US, are also feeling insecure in that sense. So, you know, let's just recognize that development as such is a deeply complex process that affects all sorts of different countries. I think that the kind of learning and soul searching that the UK itself has been able to undertake in terms of how it provides its assistance over the past 2 decades has been really important. And as I said earlier, it has really set the tone and set the trend and set agendas around, in particular, the need to understand that development is not some kind of technical problem that requires some technical solution that is simple, straightforward, black and white, and cookie cutter, but actually that it requires a real understanding of the context in which development is happening, and grappling with what are really fraught and contested power dynamics. This is not easy. I think part of the problem has been always that to make the message of aid more palatable, there has been a tendency to simplify the message. And I think, for example, if you look at the wonderful work that non-governmental organizations do everywhere, including ones that are UK based, there is a tendency to oversell what can be done through international development. You know, we can make poverty history and all of these things, and that actually can be in a way counterproductive, because then we don't give people the opportunity to understand that this is a challenge. It's a collective challenge, and we can address it collectively, but we must understand that it is not easy, and there's no sort of simplistic overnight easy answers. So I think Andrew made the point earlier about being mindful of the patronizing way in which we may be looking at this, and I think there's a bit of that happening in sort of these sort of simplified models of how easily we can change the world. We can collectively work towards that, but it does take a lot of effort, a lot of learning, and that is actually, I think, one of the key assets that now DFID has accrued over time. And I really do hope that it does not, those lessons and that learning don't get lost with the merger. Thank you.
Can I just have a 2 fingers on that one? Sorry, just quickly to reinforce that I absolutely agree with the tenor of your question, meaning the enablers of, again, in the corruption framework, the enablers of the Western enablers of corruption are not just things like banks and real estate agents and art merchants. I have to say that when I look at the money flows that are captured by kleptocratic governments in developing parts of the developing world, one of the most important ones is development assistance, and development financing even worse, where it's loans, done with international financial institutions. And that is the root of my concern about anti-corruption being built even more integrally into, like, who I want to talk to within development agencies about anti-corruption is not the anti-corruption practitioners. It's the AIDS people or the climate people. I mean, we're all talking about climate credits and things like that. Who's going to capture those revenue streams? I think it's a very, very, relevant question.
Can I also just make 2 comments? The first is that you asked Peter earlier on about the difference between aid that is spent in Britain's interest, national interest, and aid that is not. I don't believe there's that distinction. I think that the whole of the British development budget is spent in Britain's interest. Why? Because to make countries safer and more prosperous, to tackle conflict over there, makes us safer and more prosperous indirectly and directly here in Britain. And the streets of Birmingham are safer as a result of the work we've done in Somalia to try and bring some hope and order to that benighted country. Secondly, this is not a merger. It is not a merger. The D in the FCDO is entirely silent. And under Mrs. Thatcher, who was not a great lover of aid, it has to be said, there was within the Foreign Office a department for development. It was called the ODA, the Overseas Development Administration. That has gone. It's been completely smashed to pieces. So this enormously important engine of poverty elimination that was DFID, not because it was a Department of State so much, but because it brought to bear the thinking in the great universities, the policy from think tanks like the ODI, the international NGOs, it brought them all together into a whole. And all of that has gone. And if you look, all the good people are leaving. All the senior positions in the Foreign Office are with the Foreign Office. And when I was a young banker, I learned very quickly, there's no such thing as a merger. One side always comes out on top. But in this case, DFID has been completely smashed to pieces.
Andrew, thanks for that. That's a fairly kind of a very strong indication of where you think things have gone with that. With that, I kind of wanted to move it slightly as well to bring Oliver in, because we've had lots of really interesting questions. We've also had a comment that Oliver's got the best Zoom ever because it's Oliver's Elvis in the background, which I think is reasonable enough. Is the best Zoom we've seen. There's been lots of questions came in via email and also on the chat function as well. We have Rob Byrne asking, how damaging are Britain's tax havens and allowing illicit flows to escape developing countries and what action could be taken. And in a similar vein, we had Miguel asking, since your Moneyland book, Oliver, has the pandemic affected the kind of conclusions about the next couple 20 to 40 years? And I guess there's a question there about what could be done to. We know from what Sarah's saying about the role of illicit finance, and actually from what everybody's talking about, how that facilitates the kind of problems that we are spending, we're trying to use the aid to solve. And in some ways, wouldn't it be easier for us to try and plug the gaps at the start rather than at the end?
Yeah, I mean, on the Elvis point, that is actually Elvis. It may look like a cardboard cutout, but that's the king. If you've been wondering where he's been all these years, he's here with me. He keeps quiet when I'm on a Zoom. It's really interesting about Britain's overseas tax havens. Obviously, one of the things that Andrew did together with Margaret Hodge and their co-conspirators was to force the government to concede the principle of transparency in our Caribbean tax havens in Bermuda, counting Bermuda as Caribbean for the purposes of argument, which was immensely valuable and set a real message of what we hold important. Hopefully we'll see a similar principle for our crown dependencies in the Irish Sea and in the English Channel, which would be fantastic. I mean, I think what would be really valuable, one of the things I think this will be most valuable about is trying to separate out what you might call the naughty money from the evil money. If we can separate out the money flows from the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples of this world who just don't like to pay tax, if we can separate that out from the Putins and the President Xis of this world who want to sort of destabilize democracy and undermine liberalism in general, that would be a very valuable thing. I think we have to recognize that in globalized financial flows are here to stay, and we need to sort of try and dissect out the kleptocratic wealth from the legitimate wealth. And once we've done that, we'll be able to sort of corral it and essentially, hunt it down. That's the challenge. And as I think as well, I mean, as Sarah was saying, the aid is often necessary because of kleptocrats. Whether it's in northern Nigeria because of the loss of control of the government, or in eastern Ukraine, the loss of control of the government. This is corruption and human rights suffering are two sides of the same coin. One follows the other, and they feed on each other. And then an aid, the aid that's given to sort of try and solve an emergency is once again an opportunity for stealing more money. It becomes a self-perpetuating process. So for me, the most important thing is to cut it off at source. So that was why what Andrew and Margaret Hodge did with imposing transparency was so valuable, because it's a way of saying, we can try and prevent this money being stolen in the first place. You can, and I would love it if we gained a government in this country that had a far more better idea of our role in Britain as the premium enabler. No disrespect to America, our big competitor in this. One of the two premium enablers of corruption around the world is the British lawyers, British professional sector in general. I mean, that's something that was totally absent from the integrated review, tragically absent from the integrated review. And David Cameron, for all his many faults, was quite good at this. And I'd like to see a little bit of that creeping back into government doctrine. And yeah, sadly, the loss of DFID is the loss of the great sort of centre of that opinion in Whitehall, you know, and you know, I don't know what other government department would be likely to have that opinion, you know, what other department would have that holistic view of the UK's role in the world.
There's a few questions I might try and take in together and kind of pose them out, because we're coming towards the end of our time, and I wouldn't mind just putting them out there and letting you guys kind of jump in as we see fit. You know, and they're all around, I think, this kind of issue of public education. You know, if Miriam's asking, would it be good to find out what Andrew Mitchell thinks in hindsight, rolling back on DFID's funding for public education on aid and development, was that a mistake? Susan is asking, you know, DFID used to fund work in the UK to create understanding of the need for aid and what aid spending looks like. Was cutting that a mistake? Should be brought back? Louise?
I've tried to type an answer in on the first of those, which I'm not sure whether my technical skills are so bad that it won't have got through. But it was a difficult decision to take. But in the end, you know, spending British development money in Britain on teaching teachers to talk about, you know, their students being good global citizens, I just thought was wrong. And so I thought it should be spent on international development overseas. And also, you know, whenever I talked to a teacher, they all knew this stuff, and they would all say they would teach their, part of civic responsibility was teaching that, you know, we are a wealthy country, and if you want a better life in this world for your children, you need to do something about these colossal discrepancies of wealth and opportunity which disfigure our world. So, you know, I found that teachers knew this inside out, and it was therefore, I mean, I got a lot of stick for it, but it seemed to me to be the right thing to do.
Bouncing off that, I think there's been a few people who've asked this question as well, is that, like, why is cutting aid a popular policy? You know, and is there anything you can do to change that sentiment? You know, I see kind of, Alina, is that an issue? What do you think about this? Is there some way in which we could change that conversation? Because as Andrew framed this at the start, I think one of the reasons the government is doing this is because it thinks it's a politically popular decision.
Yes, well, I mean, if we think back a little bit, I think one of the really important reasons why Cameron in particular picked up on the need to protect international development assistance was to give a nicer face to the quote nasty party, right? We are a party that has solidarity with the world, and therefore we make this commitment. So I think there was a bit of politics involved in that decision, and I think, you know, Andrew explained very well why it is that it is now so convenient to politically to be cutting aid, even if it will make no difference whatsoever to the bigger budget picture in the UK. It just seems like a very easy bone to throw, let's say, to certain voters who will be very happy with this. And it's again a very simplistic, opportunistic way of appealing to voters without really considering what a short-sighted thing to do this is, because we will be back here probably in 2 years' time, having discovered that we have to reinvest in all of that, and that all of this effort that has been built over 2 decades of hard work, you know, has been undermined completely unnecessarily. So, you know, politics is a very big part of the story, and trying to, yes, you know, pretend that we're doing something that appeases a certain group of people when actually the problems are much deeper, and this is just a drop in the bucket.
I'll tell you the most interesting point about this is that when we had the era of great austerity in 2010 to 2012, we made it clear that we would not balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world, and we stood by our commitment and brought in the 0.7. You know, the Labour Party had always talked about 0.7. We actually, the Tories, brought it in. And there was some polling that I had conducted at the end of 2011. So after nearly 2 years of this, and it showed that support amongst the public as a whole had gone up from 46 to 50%. It was 49.8 or 9, I think, but it's just shy of 50%. It's gone up by 4%. That the support for Britain's development policies amongst women had gone up by much more than that. And amongst those under the age of 30, it had gone up by even more. Now, the reason for that, I think, was because we just come from opposition. We'd really thought through what we wanted to do on development. And so I think we were quite articulate about why we were doing it. And because you had David Cameron as the Prime Minister who believed in this and who thought it was a really important bit of British DNA. Now, if you have, as you have now, a Prime Minister who announces from the dispatch box of the House of Commons that DFID is, and I think I'm quoting him, a huge, great cash machine in the sky spewing out taxpayers' money, you cannot be surprised if people across the country don't think it's a good thing to do. And so, I mean, the answer to your point about what was said at the beginning is that if you say that about it, people say, well, I'd rather it was spent on my school or my hospital. I don't want to see it being sent overseas. And that is the view that populist politicians are pandering to, and it's wrong. And part of being a representative rather than a delegate in the British Parliament is you should stand up for what is right. And I think that most people know it is wrong to break this promise, and now, particularly in the middle of a pandemic, to cut our foreign direct assistance from a wealthy country to the poorest people in the world. I think it's morally wrong, and it's also not in our national interest.
Thank you very much, Andrew. You did bring in a lot of the stuff that we talked at the start, so it did feel like a very fitting bookend, and it's just 5 minutes to 6. I know we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but it feels like a fitting moment to bring this to an end. It feels as if this is a conversation that might continue in many ways. It'll continue on the page of Open Democracy, I'm sure. But more generally, I was really struck recently reading some reporting from Australia, which did something very similar in terms of merging. It merged its aid department, its kind of international development department, and its foreign office, and has ended up actually spending more money off the books now because they've struggled to meet the level of cuts they were trying to do. And there's a lot of questions about the success of that. So it does wonder if this is a conversation that's going to continue in Britain long after this. But I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists today for taking the time. Thank you for everyone who's attended. Thanks for sending so many questions as well. My apologies for not getting to all of them. I hope we've covered a lot of the issues, but as I say, I think there's a lot of issues here that could be continued on much more than this. But thank you very much. Thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for folks who are listening.